Evening and Good evening, and thank you all for attending. Tonight, Voices Israel is honored to host our special guest, the esteemed Dr. Lee Grayson, who will be interviewed by Voices Israel's Dina Yehuda and will share her insights on her poetry and award-winning writings in the interview, as well as reading her award-winning poetry. So a little bit of background on interviewer and interviewee. Dina Yehuda lives with her family in the Galilee and teaches English at Kinneret College. Her poems and short stories have been published in numerous Voices anthologies throughout the years, in IAWE ARC anthologies, Duranda Review, Midstream, Ba'or HaTorah, 10 from the Nations, and others. Her poems have also placed in Reuben Rose competitions. And I think most of us know Dina is renowned for her long tenure as the excellent and dedicated former editor-in-chief of the Voices Israel anthology. Dr. Lee Grayson is a nationally recognized researcher, educator, and author who specializes in the rhetorics of racism and anti-Semitism, especially within the realm of higher education and academia, and is an accomplished award-winning poet. Her poetry has appeared in such literary journals as Poetry Northwest, Nimrod, Columbia Journal, The Rumpus, The Pedestal, and has been nominated multiple times for the prestigious Pushcart Prize and Best of the Net, as well as having won the Good Life Review's Honeybee Poetry Prize for her poem, How to Be a Jewish Woman in America While Your Friends Sleep Fitfully in War Zones, and has also won the Poetry of Courage and Crisis Award. So a little bit of more background. Originally from Brooklyn, New York, she earned her PhD in English education from Columbia University and an MFA in creative writing from City College of New York. Formerly a tenured associate professor of English in the California State University system, Dr. Grayson now serves as Director of Education and Content Development for the Campus Climate Initiative at Hillel International, conducting workshops that challenge institutions to confront hidden biases and reform classroom dynamics to better support inclusive environments and marginalized and Jewish voices. She is author, co-author, or editor of the books Anti-Semitism in the White Supremacist Imaginary, Race Talk in the Age of the Trigger Warning, Teaching Racial Literacy, The Gendered Transaction of Whiteness, and Challenging Anti-Semitism, as well as having written numerous articles and essays. So please join me in welcoming Dina and Dr. Lee Grayson. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Donna. Start with a poem for the Red Brown Cow. Julian, will you put up the screen, or Pesach? Thank you. And Marilee will read her poems, and in between I'll ask her some questions. We'll have questions from the audience at the end.
Thank you so much, and thank you for that introduction. I'm happy to be here and talk with all of you. So this is for the red brown cow whose eyes I caught from the backseat of my mother's Chevy Nova, 1993. Some of us were honed like knives in butcher shop back rooms, and some of us were strung like meat, preserved in purgatory chill, a waiting room just cold enough to kill what wasn't dead already, our parts, precise and patient, as we never had the chance to be. I remember how we played with tangram shapes in Mrs. Hoffman's first grade class, and in junior high school, hypnotized ourselves with Tetris squares. I see them sometimes when I cannot sleep, and sometimes driving, pixelated raindrops floating upward on the windshield, pieces of a wave that crashes backward in slow motion. This is all to say the parts of me have never fit quite right. Now I know that some of us were free range kinds, traipsing out beyond the fences built to keep us grounded. I've thought of you for years. If some mouths depend on your destruction for survival, if the sound of truck tires bouncing off the interstate sets your skin on edge and makes you bare your bottom teeth, if you hopscotched past the cattle guard and hitched your way right back into a row of stock, staring out as little girls in cars flew by, their eyes as moony wide as yours, maybe you can tell me why the hooks grow sharp. And maybe we have met before, our futures dangling out ahead, more violent and colder than we'd hoped that they would be.
Wow, I think we could take the whole hour just speaking about this poem. It kind of stays with me every time I read it and reread it. So I have a couple of questions. First of all, I noticed only, I think today, how you switch from the I and the we, where in the beginning the cow speaking, and then it's the narrator. So, and that's very, for me, chilling, kind of. I mean, and the word cold, as I said to you, sort of comes again and again. But what really intrigued me here is thinking of the narrator as a child, and how being an observer, being an innocent young observer, um, it's somehow about being a writer, isn't it? Like it's a kind of seeing, a kind of empathetic seeing, perhaps, um, that sets the writer apart. Can you relate to that?
I think it's interesting. I think um, there's certainly a different way of seeing, I think, for writers, though I think it's actually different for every writer. And I wouldn't presume to speak for any other writer. Um, I think one of the things that for me was so influential in how I saw moments and movement and just life, I think, as a child. I grew up, my father was an actor and director. And so I grew up actually acting. And for me, it was that idea of putting myself, be really as empathetically, I think, as possible into somebody else's viewpoint and trying to understand other people. I think I will add there's probably also a little bit of trauma in my childhood that probably made me hyper vigilant and seeing some things maybe always on, like always trying to see that emotional response from people in a way that's maybe a little less positive than my initial framing. Um, but I think that was always sort of how I saw the world, was in these little moments. And then I would wonder what comes before that moment. How does that moment get here? Um, it's one thing that's always so interesting for me is how people read poetry. Like I never want to prescribe a reading of my work for people. I will tell you when this poem was published, I don't remember if it was this editor or another editor that like I think I remember it was accepted into two places and it was like almost simultaneous, but I had to go with the first one. Um, and one of the editors wrote to me that this was this like they remarked on the feminist reading of it. And the second I looked at the poem, I was like, oh, of course. And it's like, I don't actually think I intended it. I might have subconsciously intended it, but sometimes things just appear in the work. I think, especially when you have the reader coming to the work and bringing all of their lived experiences and their ways of seeing the world too. And so now when I see this poem, of course, that's how I see it. And yet
Mm.
when I was writing it, it was not intentional. And I actually felt similarly. I mentioned this because you said the cow is speaking. And I never thought of the cow as speaking.
Ah,
And I
because
love that you saw that.
because in the
Now I have another way
beginning,
of reading it.
yeah, no, because you say in the beginning, some of us were honed like knives in butcher shop back rooms. Some of us were strung like meat. I mean, I suppose that can also be, human beings. But I heard the cow,
Yeah, it was totally the speaker projecting onto the cow.
Right, right. And it made
And
it
yet it
very,
could be read both ways. Yeah.
made it really interesting for me, that kind of empathy. Okay, let's go on to the next one. And then we'll talk about that. Thank you.
Do you want me to wait for the share screen or do you want me to? Oh, there we are.
Yeah, please wait for the share
Okay.
screen. Should be any second now.
All
It
right.
should be listening to America.
This is Listening to America. I find myself feeling homesick for a world that never existed. There is no falling out of the picture because there is no picture. There was no frame to fall out from, but the moon rose over 1,000 blurred red lamps, freckling the hills, doubling back east after midnight. Oh, she holstered her arsenal upon my ankle, left her language on my shoulder blade, a knife that sounded almost like a voice in an open field. When it rains in Southern California, the doors lock by themselves. Stoned, I look at the scenery, a desert wrangled, bound, a tree that's so consumed with thirst will fell itself, palms filled with meal, a mouth that does not open when set free. I am running out of ways to language about palm trees. If only I had known I'd need a different tongue, one that could predict the weather. It was over before the plane touched down in JFK. No, there is no back to turn back to. Instead, 1,000 red lamps in a line, sitting stoned and still, counting the cars on the New Jersey Turnpike.
Wow. Oh, wow. Okay. So this is a bit, refers a bit to Simon and Garfunkel, because the New Jersey Turnpike, right? And the
Yeah, there's lines actually from the song America scattered throughout. I usually have, like, I think when I've published it with the note of like, it actually uses lines that are directly taken from Simon and Garfunkel.
right,
Yeah.
the nice, very different, of course, commentary to it. I wanted to ask you about two things. First of all, I was very struck with the feeling homesick for a world that never existed. Um, but that's such a beautiful and resonant idea. And then you write a lot about language, right? Left her language on my shoulder blade, a knife that sounded almost like a voice. And then especially a mouth that does not open when set free. I thought how tragic. Um, and then you say I need a different tongue, and I'm running out of ways to language. So could you relate a little bit to that? How do you use language here? What does that mean for you? A mouth that doesn't open when it's set free.
I think there's something in the borrowing of language, right? Borrowing language from others, borrowing language from those that have been influential for our own use of language, but also our ways of just making meaning in the world. Um, so I think there's something in that for me is when we don't have the language to describe our own experiences, for example, where do we find that language? Is that language in the inspiration that we get or the solace that we take in other texts, or in this case, particular song that is one of my favorites, if not my favorite song? Um, I think I want to do justice to, I think I went backward through your question. Um, the idea of this homesickness for a place that never existed. Place is important here, and you'll see this, I think, in a lot of my poems. There's this going back and forth. I think, as was said in the introduction, I'm from New York, and then I lived in California for many years, and I moved out to California not long before the pandemic began. So it was I was really grappling at that time with how do I make sense of this new place when my relationship to place is so strange, because place suddenly became, rather than this, I spent 2 years with this landscape of palm trees and ocean and sand, and and then suddenly my landscape was completely closed, right? My landscape was very small all of a sudden. And so I was still trying to work through what I knew about this new place that I was in without always being in that place. Or at least outside of outside of my apartment in that place. Um, and trying to sort of make sense of what is this, what is our relationship to the place and the things that populate it and the differences between the different places that I've been in. And I think one of those is this idea of an America, right? And I think that's some of what is happening in Simon and Garfunkel's song, that there's so much searching for an idea. And it's that idea that sustains people, but is that idea the same as the real thing?
Wow, thank you. I think for me, I'm also from Brooklyn, and I'm also homesick, perhaps for an America. I don't know if it really did exist, but certainly growing up in the '60s in the United States, and it was very different as a Jewish woman um, than it is today. I think a lot of us can relate to that. But let's go on to kettle of fish. It's really a different kettle of fish.
This is Kettle of Fish. 1. The heavy lidded kettle cover hovers at my head, the photo frame that frames a storm. Every jacket photo poet is my father. My father was not a poet. He breathed the bottomless, dreamt in jazz, poured spontaneous across the country. These men pour from pictures, graveyard risen, great unwritten, bottle fisted, blue eyed beat men. These men blow deep, these men of contours, men who speak in pictures, painters at the Cedar once, Jack outside the West End once, my father at the half note, gone, once wrapped and kept by trumpet tolls. 2. We've awoken 6:30 to key teeth poised and catching, turning inhalation over exhalation, catching on to shadows slipping out. There is always somewhere else to sleep, from someone else to borrow. We work, we break the fasts of 8 wage hours at 6:30, unbuttoned down, cold beers in hand with heels to kick. At night we dance in cold beer puddles, cold floor skidding, cold and willing, cold hard women. We uneven, pinstriped women stripping off the vestiges we're born to bear. 3. Jack's blue eyes now drain like dust clouds, pouring puddles on the tabletop. You know what it's like inside a place like this. The fish are breathing, air too thick for swallows. Birds can't fly through shuttered windows. In spilled beer puddles, we are small, shoes sliding toward each other, meeting at the conversation middles. These great unwritten, good gone wild, woken women, these women, they're emasculating. Shrill peak pitches carry while a deeper voice resounds. Both arms open, standing still between the ghost men, this sleepwalk worship spills across my hands.
Wow. It's interesting because what I bolded, I don't know, for myself, is what you read really in a bolder way. I bolded these great unwritten, good gone wild, woken women, these women, they're emasculating. For me, that's like the heart of what you want to say. It's also interesting. I'd like to ask you about technically, the poem is really so masterful. You know how it's very controlled for one and two, and then it sort of like spills over. It's like you break out of those, those earlier stanzas, and also you repeat words again, and then they resonate, deeper. Um, so can you talk a little bit about how the men here are ghost men and the women emasculating?
Yeah, if I could, I'll speak a little bit to what the comment that you just made about the style. I wrote this and a number of other poems actually that are all sort of about beat writers and about that time period. When I was in actually like a very Whitman phase, I was reading a lot of Walt Whitman. And so I was getting really into this sort of long line, free verse, ongoing, in a way that I think actually is probably not that similar to most of my work. Um, and it was very enjoyable. And then I think I put also as like I think a lot of work on poetry happens in revision. I think I would say 99% of work on poetry happens in revision.
I know
Um,
Walt Whitman revised Leaves of Grass over and over and over.
he did. Oh, and that, yeah, I like I have to say I like the earlier published version better than the later published version, but that is just me. Um, revision is not always ideal, but maybe he revised it to something that was more significant to him at that moment in time, right? Um, so I think I made it more controlled and I made it more fitting with my own style rather than being as derivative, I think, as it was initially, because it wasn't a period of time where I was really working with some building my own voice and working with another voice. And again, as I said, we draw inspiration from so many different places. Um, I have a lot of pieces where my father was very much part of the beat movement, and I have a lot of pieces where I've paralleled, I think, my father and Jack Kerouac in some ways that are Kerouac was in some ways his hero, and in some ways that doesn't make sense at all if you knew my father. um, I think my father was a far better person than Jack Kerouac, if I'm, if I'm being judgmental about a figure that I didn't actually know. Um, but there was always this idea of Kerouac, I think, not only in my home, like my dad gave me a copy of On the Road when I was 12 years old. And he was like, you will understand it someday. And I did. And I didn't understand it then, but I understood it later. And I always sort of grew up with these male beats and like seeing myself in these stories and these narratives and poetry, and yet also realizing how the women were depicted at that time and how the women were secondary in those same narratives. So I was reading a lot of Joyce Johnson's work as well and thinking about what is this way that she saw him and this way that she could see him through that lens and also or she could see him through the idolatry, I think, that a lot of people placed on those figures and the way that we still, especially in like, you know, poetry programs, poetry MFA programs, still tend to look, maybe not today, but definitely a couple of decades ago, we're still looking at the beat figures, these masculine beat figures, and at the same time be able to question and challenge. Well, that is a very masculine view of the world and of that movement itself, and what was limiting. Where were the women's voices at that time? Because there were so many fascinating female writers whose work is just not as well known, but is doing a lot of the same things. But both the women that I knew personally from that time and that place, like thinking of particular locations again, and the women whose work I read saw themselves differently too. Um, so I think there's some really interesting relationships here between I believe, how we see our own identity and then how we see collective identity.
Well, and as a poet, you're able to take something very individual and personal, and we can all kind of, feel there's something that speaks to all of us, I think. Especially now in the next poem, I think for those of us in Israel, um, this may be the most relevant. So I want to give this a bit more time. If you can read How to Be a Jewish Woman in America. And also tell us, why it's spelled the way it's spelled, America.
Can I tell you after? Do you want me to tell you
Of
now?
course, no, of course, of course.
I'll tell you after then. Okay. Okay, this is How to Be a Jewish Woman in America While Your Friends Sleep Fitfully in War Zones. I open with a quote from Peter Levine. I saw in my mind's eye the fleeting image of a tiger poised for attack. Unlike the impala, though, we tend to have trouble returning to normal after being in this state. Arrange your body on the dais. Be the script of Sunday's sermon, wrath and fear and their belief that God and mortal beings chose this world for you. Hide your father's star between your breasts, where mother's white fur stole like skin. Tie yourself in knots, undo the binds, embrace the dissonance, or don't. Then drive, alone to Monticello, pace the grounds, trod down by unpaid sweat and violence. Cross the country, slow, through sovereign lands and sundown towns. Knuckle gray your grip, keep the music low. Where liminality, intangible, distinguishes geography from place, and women like you know the steps from door to shelter. There, they huddle close until the sirens cease, at least tonight. So visit Rushmore, mount its face, and smile, unnatural as 8 eyes, 4 mouths of stone. Go, climb the crown of Lady Liberty to set her torch on fire. Become your own panopticon. Project yourself in all directions, spiral in, and look around. No tiger in the corner now. The tiger's in your rib cage, scraping at your lungs.
It's such an amazing poem, and you read it so well. I'm so glad you're reading it. I don't even know where to start here, but for
Well, I
me,
promised to tell you the title. I promised to tell you about
yes,
the title, so I'll do
yeah,
that.
why don't you do that first? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so the KKK is in America is just a reference to the Ku Klux Klan and the
Okay.
embeddedness of the Ku Klux Klan in the American ethos over throughout American history.
Okay.
It is there is a pattern of some writers and activists doing that. So
Hmm.
that there were different points in time where people spelled it that way. I thought it was fitting for the poem.
Hmm.
Um, I'll pause there. I have a lot of complex feelings about it, but I'll pause there.
Okay, no, I'm glad you explained that because I didn't see that. Um, for me, I mean, hide your father's star between your breasts. I've spoken to friends abroad or even Israelis who've visited abroad and who put their Magen David now inside their clothes. Or when they take an Uber, they're very careful who the driver is, or they don't give the exact address. They'll go next door, or they very careful not to say that they live in Israel. Or um, it's it's amazing poem. I don't really know what else to ask you, but maybe you could talk about writing it.
Yeah, I mean, I think as you know, as you said, there's so much research now, and like just looking at polling from students in the U.S. and around the world of how many. I think it's something like 41% of students are feel like they need to hide some part of their Jewish identity in public spaces on their own on the campus that they attend. And that's something that I think is it just it sort of tells you where we are and the different ways that people have managed that. But I think what's interesting is that if you look at some of the statistics on like anti-Semitism on campus for the past like 20 years, there's, or let's say not statistics, let's say research more broadly. There's scholarship interviews with students where students talk about hiding hiding Jewish stars 20 years ago. And so what we have are, I think, in some ways, very similar dynamics, the really dramatic exacerbation thereof in the past couple of years. Um, I actually started writing this poem in like 21 or 22. And I was trying to, I've done a lot of work on the racialization of Jewish people, particularly in the US, but not solely in the US, sort of how we project this very US centric understanding of race and racism onto the entire world and somehow think that's logical. Sorry for the sarcasm, but come on. There are things that I was trying to make sense of in terms of how does my own experience as a light-skinned Jewish woman who lives in the United States fit in with these frameworks that maybe don't really speak to my experience? And what are the dissonances between my lived experience and what people tell me my experience is, which is often very different. Although I think when you get into the space of telling people what their experience is, you've already gone off the tracks. Um, this was actually like originally a sonnet. This was a totally different poem originally. So again, revision. Revision is one of my favorite things. I love going back into a piece. I spent years with this poem, and I did not finish it. I would say it was like maybe the first few lines and some pieces of this that I kept, and then after October 7th, it really I think became a somewhat different poem, or it took on what it is now. And I was just thinking about conversations I was having with people I knew who were running to shelters in the middle of the night, and their experience was so wildly different from mine. And yet we were all experiencing the effects of anti-Semitism and ways of being seen by the world that were telling us who we were. And so I was that again, so this poem I think it's actually probably one of the first times, trying to think, one of the first times that I think I've ever published a poem that was like really explicit about my relationship to my Jewish identity and to anti-Semitism, which is interesting because I write about it in so many other ways. I write about it in scholarship, I write about it in essay and narrative, but this
That's
was
interesting.
very different for me.
Was that different emotionally? Writing it as a poem, it's very different, right? I mean, it's not as cool. Cool in the sense of emotionally, there's a lot of emotion there, right?
Yeah, no, I heard you exactly with the word cool. Yes, there is definitely a way I think that, um, and I think scholarship has helped me do that in a lot of ways, being able to distance my personal, even when I'm speaking personally or speaking from experience, I'm not necessarily speaking in the same tone or register.
Right.
And so there is this remove, right? That allows a different type of processing and it doesn't feel as heavy.
Right.
But there was no other way for me to write this.
Right.
Like I've written plenty about anti-Semitism. I could write this as, a piece of scholarship, but it's not going to feel the same thing.
Right.
And I
And
think
also
that's
as a reader, it of course hits us very differently. I guess that's the power of the language of poetry, that it's so compressed and it evokes in us so much emotion.
I liked that. I've always liked the idea that like, so I've written stories and I like narrative over time. I've gone through like narrative periods, but there's something to me about the way that poetry exists in the moment. Even narrative poetry, which can tell a story of sorts, right? There's something about it that just gives reverence to a moment, to a feeling, to something so small. And it makes it, for that page or two, it makes it so much bigger. And then you take something that's really big, right, in a person's life, in a person's experience, in a community, in the world, and somehow try to make it small and meaningful on the page. And it's to me both a fascinating intellectual exercise, but also a really fascinating, like, introspective exercise.
I'm curious about the process here in this poem. You spoke about that you've written it over a long period, and I'm just curious about the Peter Levine quote, if that came later and the ending of the tiger later, or if that was like a hook.
That's interesting. I actually think, if I remember correctly, you're asking me to remember 5 years ago. If I remember correctly, I actually had that quote pretty early. It's a pretty common like trauma concept or trauma coping thing of like, I don't know if anybody's ever done this exercise, but like you literally look around and the idea is you're supposed to look in the corner and say, there's no tiger in the corner. There's no
Mm,
tiger in the corner. Like my nervous system doesn't have to be doing all this work that it's doing because there's no tiger here. And
mm,
it sounds very silly the first time you do it. It feels very, very silly the first time you do it, especially if there's people around you. Um, but I found that for myself, it was like, okay, that's actually grounding. But then when you
mm,
think about something like, so I think I had that really early because I was trying to make sense of like how, with something like anti-Semitism that has many thousands of years history in different forms, um, and often the same forms, how, yes, we can say there's no tiger right there, but that doesn't mean it doesn't live somewhere, not only in us, but also that as we see, as we saw, I think with October 7th, obviously, but also after, it's so easy for it to come up.
mm,
We can say that things are better, things are easier, things are different, and then all of a sudden we have the same dynamics that are so familiar, I think, internally to many of us, but also in outward lived experience. And so I was trying to use that I think actually began pretty early with that quote as almost as a framing. I don't know if
right.
I had put the quote in I don't typically put quotes directly in poems. So I don't know if the quote itself was there, but it was definitely that idea.
No, I think it's wonderful how you frame it and then come back to it at the end. I mean, for many of us, that process, could be very helpful. Seeing how that frames it. Okay, the next amazing poem. Take a deep breath, and also another very strong poem.
It is a longer one. Let
Yes,
me hydrate. Okay. All
sure.
right. This is How to Be the Mother of a Missing Daughter. 1. Don't cry, but make sure that your eyes are wet when reporters ask about hers. Doleful, pupil stained, and haunted. Don't get upset when politicians call her beautiful. Listen to publicists. Ignore the pull to read stories about other missing women. Stand rigid as a pinstripe. Bring tissues, don't use them. Proclaim innocence if tables turn. Wear blue, not black, and cling to hope. Bear the blanket of her absence. 2. Somebody will ask, what type of woman lets her daughter disappear? Do they think you closed your eyes or gave your permission or that she'd come to you at all? You'll sink into whirlpools of guilt and shame that tinker with you, then toss you back out alone. You'll wonder how long her blonde hair has grown, if she's changed her name by now, if maybe you did close your eyes, if only you'd known better, if she'll always be your baby. 3. But whatever you do, don't cry. They'll say you're unstable, that of course you could kill your own child. Rodents do it every day. The public will vilify you, and still you shouldn't cry. A woman writer will do an expose on lingering postpartum depression. The Washington Post will publish it online. Twitter users will suggest therapy. A few, not most, will warn that doesn't work for abusers. 4. Start to notice things you've never noticed before, like how girls hold their fathers' hands differently from their mothers. Make a list of everything you see, the narrow bands of light that stripe out as the sun expands across the bedroom wall, the trapezoid of your husband's shoulders, how he avoids answering the most benign of queries and offers no words to describe the void you notice between the fronds of palm trees. 5. Returning from another press conference, notice the web of rockfall mesh along the freeway. Crane your neck in reverence as you drive past, knowing however strong or thick the netting that contains the long stretch of rock wall, there is no chance it won't come down eventually. Fits of rage and impotence swell and give birth behind your eyes. Don't try to quell them. It's futile, this trying to hold back the earth.
Wow. So, first of all, I'm curious if this was a specific kind of case that you're relating to. It seems like it is, or a number of cases.
So again, we take inspiration from all different places, right? Beat writers, Whitman, true crime podcasts, true crime TV shows. I was one of the things that I was doing this for, I would say, a whole summer probably, when I was sort of treating it as like a poetry focused sabbatical for myself when I wasn't teaching as much over the summer. At one point, I was watching a lot of like forensic files, like really terrible documentaries about true crime. And then also some relatively good, listening to some podcasts and watching some relatively good documentaries that were a little more nuanced. Um, and I was noticed like, what are these patterns? So that was one piece of this. I will also say I have a book that's coming out hopefully this year or early next. It's a piece of scholarship, but it's also connected to a case that I was very close to when I was younger. It's not the same story. It's not about what is depicted here, but it was a public case, a public crime case. And I think I was trying to make sense of a lot of these things together and trying to use the frames that I was seeing, all these patterns that I was seeing in these true crime narratives, how they're all presented so similarly, to try to make sense of something that really was different. And then there's some other, there's, I think, familial relationships in here. It's doing a few different things in different places. But I think there's this idea that there's supposed to be a script for somebody when they grieve, and what happens if you grieve publicly, and how does that script fail to actually represent the individuality and nuance of human experience. Because there are all these expectations and assumptions that no matter what, you're going to do the wrong thing. And yet there might be these little core elements of truth in each of those moments, but that doesn't become the narrative that people see.
Wow. It strikes me, I remember thinking that when women get upset or something terrible happens, they tend to take it into themselves. I'm not a psychologist or anything, but they tend more to get depressed, and you talk about guilt and shame, whereas men very often become aggressive, right, and take it out on other people. And you definitely feel like that. And I was struck with in stanza 4, when you talk about start to notice things you've never noticed before, like how girls hold their father's hands differently from their mothers. And also the male here, how he avoids answering the most benign of queries and offers no words to describe the void. Thought that was, I don't know, so amazing. Kind of that there's no comfort there. There's no understanding. There's no empathy.
And when we're grieving, right, we look to people around us, and yet I think we expect certain types of responses, fair or not, right? Those expectations are also individual. So then are these, like, you see so many families after whether it's a criminal incident or injury or death, that families fall apart. And so because so many people are viewing things differently, there's this suspicion and distrust between people as well. And so we might feel the projections of other people's, or we might feel other people's expectations, and then we project our own expectations onto somebody else, and are looking for things that may or may not be there, right? When you start noticing patterns, I think that's it's one of the, I would call it like I would joke maybe it's an occupational hazard. Like, I notice patterns of language because I work with rhetoric. So I'm always looking for, well, this is like, how do I view the world through those patterns? Well, as I was saying earlier, with like applying frameworks to other parts of the world where they maybe don't fit, what if our own patterns don't actually fit? And so we're looking for things to try to make sense of something, and it may not be what's actually there.
It reminded me, it brought me to something biblical, but that's sort of my frame of reference very often. But with Hannah, right, when her husband Elkanah, and she's in such distress, and then he says, but um, sons, my love is greater than seven sons. And why aren't you? Isn't that enough for you? As if you can quantify love, right? As opposed to like Boaz, and their language to each other is so full of compassion, understanding. They see the good in each other. It's really so tragic. The people here who can't use language to fill the void. The mouth that opens, but nothing comes out. It's very profound, and I think your poetry is so amazing. And just sort of, I've been thinking about a lot of these phrases for the past few weeks. So thank you so much for writing it, for explaining about it, for reading it so beautifully. I think now we have time for questions, unless Marilee, you want to say anything else that I haven't asked.
No, I'd love to hear. I'd love to hear what people's minds.
Great. Okay, I think we can stop share. And we're putting this, please ask Marilee questions.
Okay, I have actually just a procedural question, Mara, which is, I would love it if we could all get a copy of the screen shared poems, the file that was screen shared. Do you agree to this? Would it be possible?
I have absolutely no problem with that.
Mm-hmm. And I wanted to say also, to say to everybody that Mara is a member of our GG2 group, and I am grateful for every time that she can manage to come, because I know her schedule is so busy. But every time she comes, she so enhances the conversation that I'm just waiting and hoping that she'll be able to come again. So thank you very much, Mara.
Judy, can you tell us for a minute about the group, about what that is, GG2?
Oh, Global Group 2, it's one of our groups for, originally the idea was that it would be for overseas members and anybody in Israel who didn't have a convenient local group. But it turned out that pretty well anybody could join it, even if they were already going to a different group. But right now it happens to have 14 members, and I am coordinator, and I'm the only Israeli in it. All the rest of them are really from England, from Canada, from the States, of course. And it's a lovely group. It really is.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Could I make a comment, please? Yes? No?
Yes.
I don't know who you're asking, but I'll say yes, please.
Okay, that's good enough for me. Judy, I just wanted to say that Marilee is widely published, and a number of the magazines that she's published in also have her reading the poem that they've published. So I have some of that material, but perhaps when Julian puts on the YouTube, when he loads the YouTube, he may put a page on with some of that information.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Ira. I certainly would like to see it, and I'll have to find the time myself to go chase up some of your readings, Mara.
I am happy to send you links to stuff if you'd like them. But yeah, it's become actually I think a more common thing recently that they've been posting audio, especially in online journals, which I quite like.
And not everyone reads as well, but it certainly enhanced the poetry. Ellie Ben Ben Joseph, you have a question.
Yeah, I have a question. First, I should say I'm also from Brooklyn,
Where in Brooklyn are you from? Can I ask?
Bensonhurst and Flatbush.
Sheepshead Bay.
Yeah, I live very close to Brooklyn College and went there uh, for my first for my bachelor's degree.
I lived across the street from Brooklyn College at one point.
Oh, okay, but I'm 83, so we probably didn't cross paths.
You win.
Anyway, this is a question I have. I have also done studies in anti-Semitism, and I wrote my doctoral dissertation on anti-Semitism and published a book afterwards. But I have a question that's related to projecting yourself into another person's personality. And I've written a few poems in which I project myself into the personality of women that I have known and loved. I don't get the wrong idea. Uh, anyway, my question is this. You're writing about how it feels to be a Jew in America today and to feel on edge about it. But my question is about the people who support, the Jewish people who support somebody like Mamdani and how they put the world together, because I haven't got a clue. And that's my question. Have you considered writing a poem about how they might put the world together? I mean, it could be quite, how can I say, ironic, um, paradoxical, maybe. That's the question.
So honestly, my first instinct is to tell you that if that's what's on your mind, I think you should write that poem. I think you would be much better at writing that poem because that's where your mind is, and you've already created a conceit for it, right? You've already created the shape of this poem in some way, and I would be really curious what that poem would be, and I would love it if you would write that. I I try very hard to speak from sort of the intersection of personal experience and what I know about from like through scholarship, right? And I try not to, I think there's being able to empathize for somebody like with somebody else's experience, being able to imagine somebody else's experience, whether you agree with it or not, to try to understand how does somebody get there. Like the leaps of logic, right? What are the steps? I always think of it as like a ball bouncing from one thing to the next. What are the spaces in logic, these jumps that they've taken to get to something? Um, and I can do that. I can imagine it with, somebody that I don't agree with or who sees the world differently. And yet I don't actually know that that's what they're doing, right? And so I try very much not to speak from really other people's perspectives, even in places where, like, especially in my poetry, in places where I'm going into or drawing a parallel maybe between different experiences or trying to imagine an experience. They're all kind of me. And yet at the same time, I think it's helpful. I always say, like, the speaker is not the poet. The speaker is different. It's this separate self, separate identity that we've put on. And I know some poets are very, people write from like the perspective of a lunchbox. I've never understood that type of poetry. I'm not denigrating it. I've never really gotten it. I've always felt like sometimes people will read my poetry and assume that things in it are true or they're exactly what I think or what I have experienced. And that's not always the case because there's certainly the speaker that becomes a separate entity. But I think there's always an element of myself in it. And so it would be hard for me, I think, to write from a perspective to use the I in a way that I really, really don't. believe. But I think there's something else in your question, maybe, which is how do you reconcile, like, knowing that there are people who see the world in very different ways and their own experience in very different ways, and we can't really speak for each other. And I think sometimes we wind up speaking for each other if we're not arguing with each other, or even when we are arguing with each other.
Thank
All
you.
of that to say, I think you should write the poem, and I'd like to read it.
Okay.
Hi. Sorry. You all right?
Well, I would like to say something.
Was Miriam, did you have
Miriam,
a...
sorry.
Now, Miriam is
Yeah.
going to get her echo taken care
We're
of.
just waiting for a technical.
And then maybe Pesach will ask his question, and then Miriam, okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
Hi, I don't actually have a question, I have a comment. America is a song that I really love. And particularly one line in the song in which the speaker or the singer is riding on the bus, looking out the window, and the moon rose over an open field. And that line always touched me, and I could never understand why it touched me. It's a very simple line, a very simple image, simple English words. Why would it touch me like that? And then you come along and you say, hey, wait a second. On the New Jersey Turnpike, the moon doesn't rise over an open field. The moon rises over 1,000 blurred red lamps freckling the hills. And I felt like, yeah, exactly. On the New Jersey Turnpike, the moon rises over all the sets of taillights, and I felt like somebody's being honest for a change. Finally, we're getting the truth about the New Jersey Turnpike, and I felt liberated. And so I just want to thank you for liberating me. And
I love it. I will take it. I think it's that place between reality and fantasy, right? Like
yeah,
the song is so...
And especially how it fits in with your title about feeling homesick for a world that never existed.
But it sounds fabulous, right? It sounds like
Yes.
it paints this wonderful fantasy.
Yeah, yeah,
That isn't necessarily real.
right.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
Oh, thank you. Hi, Mara. Thank you so much. Yeah, great work. Two questions. The one is about your titles. They're long, many of them, and quite explanatory. And I was just sort of wondered what you were thinking, how you work with titles. That was a specific question. Then the other question I think you've spoken about, it was about just expanding a little on the sort of links and what's actually in common between academic writing and poetical writing. I mean, I think the personal detached thing takes us not very, it's true, but it doesn't take us far enough. I'm an academic and I write poetry, so I think about the ways of writing and how they're distinct, but also what holds them together and what they share.
Yeah, I love that. We could spend an hour, we could spend probably a week on that. But so the first question about titles, I used to like call things untitled. I used to put like no effort into titles and I didn't think about them. And then I realized at some point, oh, the title's part of the poem, which sounds like a very obvious way of thinking about it. But for some reason, I don't know, it took me a while to realize that. And then realizing that you can do certain things, especially if you're working with form, like where you don't have space for it, let's say, in the poem itself. You can fit certain things into the title. So you get that little extra piece. And I really like that because I will say a lot of my revision is cutting. I tend to overwrite. I believe it's overwriting because there's just more in things than I I want to ultimately be in there. And so I spend a lot of time cutting back. And so the title gives me like this something extra that I can take, a line that I couldn't keep in the poem for whatever reason and make, and that helps to do some of the work of the poem. As far as your question about, yeah, I mean, I think there's that distance sometimes between, like, it's artificial, the idea that like academic writing is cold. In certain disciplines, there are reasons why you remove the I, for example. In my discipline, you don't remove the I. So I don't think it's necessarily even across the board, but there's a lot of, I think, depending on the type of academic writing we're talking about, I think there's a lot of space for narrative, but I also, and for personal experience and for voice. I think it makes a lot of academic writing better, and certainly more fun to read. But I do also think we want to think, like, where is it actually useful and relevant and doing something, and where is it that we've elevated, maybe not elevated, that we've mistaken the experiential for the analytical. I think of like bell hooks saying, like, you need to have both, right? That it can't just be analytical without any understanding of where the self intersects, but it also can't be just personal, that you have to have some sort of blend of the experiential and the analytical, especially when you're speaking to your own experience. And yet we know, I think in academia, there's still a lot of people who look down on the I, even just saying I, right? That somehow you have become less scholarly because you've admitted that you yourself as a scholar are also a human being who has moved through the world in certain ways. And I do a lot of work that sort of blurs personal and professional and personal and scholarly in my scholarship. And it's something I always try to thread really carefully. Am I doing enough of the critical reflection upon my own experience and my own ideas to make sure that I'm still keeping up, like, what I would, scholarly rigor, so to speak, in the way that I'm talking about myself? I don't know. I'm curious how you approach that as someone who is both in the academy and writing poetry.
As you say, there's something to be written about that, I think. About the link. Thank you.
Thank you. Miriam.
Hi. As a musician, I'm really, really interested in the way that the rhythms of your work and the cadences. I don't know if I need to explain what I mean by that, but the way they stop, the flow stops in unexpected places, and the rhythms are they sort of add to the poetry. It's not that you've hooked your poetry onto a rhythm. It's that the rhythm is integral with the poem, and it changes according to what you want to get out of your poetry. That really, really impressed me as a musician, and I wondered how, if you have a sort of musical background, or how it appears to you when you're writing it, this fluidity of rhythm and the sudden changes, the sudden pauses in unexpected places. I think it really gives a huge depth to your poetry, and I wondered how conscious you are of, well, obviously you are, but I mean, if you could explain how you come to write it like that.
Yeah, thank you. So it's as far as musical background, unless you consider, like, taking guitar lessons when I was a kid, I don't have as much of a musical background, at least not in terms of my own musical capacity. I did work in radio for a little bit. And for me, it's always like, I hear the poem when I'm writing it. Why I was saying earlier that I love that some journals now will ask you to record audio of a poem, because if you think about the way that poetry has traditionally, historically engaged people, a lot of it has been as partly as performance. So I always hear it. I will speak it out loud to myself. I'm in the shower and I'm speaking a poem that I'm writing because I want to know how it sounds. I want to make sure that the sound quality is there. It's interesting. Somebody had asked me once who my poetic influences were, and I named a bunch of people, and they were like, "Oh, I really thought it would have been these formal poets who worked in verse and meter because of that sound quality." And they've not historically been the biggest influences on me. I've tried to but I think the meter itself is. There's something about the sound of a poem to me that is so significant. And I think that extends into prose. I think that's one of those places where people will say, well, poetry is different because it has meter. But if you read a really good, paragraph out loud, it has it too. And it's one of the things that gets people connected to it is the sound of the language. And so I think that's one of the most important pieces of a poem. I don't know how conscious it always is. It's another thing that for me gets to be much more conscious in revision. If I notice I'm doing something, then I'll see, okay, how am I doing it? Do I want to play with this? Do I want to keep going here, or do I need to stop? Is it going to seem like what I don't like is when things feel when they feel too perfect, when they feel exactly like they're supposed to be, like you've taken the standard form, and then you've replicated it. And I don't want to always go with people's expectations. I often want to challenge them in terms of sound, because I don't think our ways of making meaning of the world always fit those expectations. So I think you've heard it in a way that you've explained it to me in a way that I don't know if anybody's ever explained it to me that way before. I love that. Thank you.
You certainly did it. You certainly did it. So yeah, it was very deep, much deeper than it would have been if you had not done that.
It's interesting because I saw it more visually. For me, it's visually surprising and arresting because it's not most of the poems were not this typical shape that I would have expected. And it was always surprising.
It's interesting. I always think visually is much harder for me. I'm much more visually I have to my instinct, I think sometimes, is if it's not a form poem, is couplets. Just put it in couplets. And then I start playing with it. But it's actually it's almost like that's a piece of it that I have to do a lot more intentionally. And so I always think when people are revising things, what kinds of different lenses are you bringing to the revision? Are you going with what feels natural and comfortable, or are you doing something that is a little not always your way of seeing things?
Wow, thank you so much. I'm trying to look at the clock here, and I know that Ira has a few words, but I see that Judy and is that Bijo? It says Bijo Prince. So maybe very briefly, Judy.
Okay. Mara, I was thinking about something you said earlier about that you didn't get object poems people write from the perspective of a lunchbox, etc. And I was thinking back over the object poems that I personally saw the point of and liked, and it occurred to me that what they were doing was really what should I say? They were projecting human emotions into the object, and they were showing how human experience could be related to what you would imagine would be the experience of. I'm thinking of John Edwards' Bridge, for example, which is he's a British poet who won a prize for that poem. And I'm wondering if object poems don't make sense to you, at least on that level, or are you just thinking of the ones that don't have this business of portraying human emotions from a different perspective?
They make sense to me in terms of what people are doing with them. They just don't make sense to me as a poet. Like it's not a thing that's ever occurred to me to write. And when I've tried, when I've tried as like an exercise, it's been terrible. Um, like I know sometimes we'll take things on as like, let's try this as a prompt. Let's do this as a prompt. And it's just, for me, it's a thing that's not worked. Um, I don't know why. I think it's interesting. I would think about it, but I think some people are great at it, and I think some of them, like, it's not like I'm against the poems. It's just not a way that I make sense of things.
Although you do use from the cow's point of view, I thought you did that super well. It wasn't.
But not intentionally.
Very interesting. Okay, so Dina? Yes.
Yes. Dear Mara, I want to ask, what poem do you love? A poem that you don't know all the poet's white, or a poem that the poet white with a mastery of play or something.
So a couple of poems that I love that I think are playing with things that are, or saying things in ways that clearly make sense to them, that don't necessarily have to make sense to me in the same way. There's a poem by Jeffrey McDaniel. He was a spoken word. He was a spoken word poet and written poet, called "The Benjamin Franklin of Monogamy." It's pretty it's self-explanatory what the conceit is. I'll leave it at that. But the imagery is just so unique that it's so clearly this is how this person sees the world, and sees objects and time and feelings. And I love that piece. I really love Nearly a Valediction by Marilyn Hacker. So more form in some ways. In a very different example, I used to teach this with my students, and I'd be like, it's from, it's like what, 17th century, I think, or 18th century, but it's a very cool poem, To His Coy Mistress by Andrew Marvell, which I still think is a really great poem that works on multiple levels and continues to be hilarious to me. And it's one of those things that if you keep at, the more you analyze it, the better it gets.
So if we had worlds enough in time, I would say I would continue with questions. But I think in order to finish on time, Ira, you wanted to say a few words, and thank you so much. Marilee?
I do, thank you. I've been accused of getting everything backwards. You won't be disappointed tonight. First, my appreciation to our audience. You changed what might have been a marvelous presentation into an extraordinary event. Thank you to our Voices Israel team, Dana, Dina, and Pesach. Dana Bachar, your generous and heartful words opening this evening. Dina Yehuda, your talent for interviewing and insightful questions guided us through every moment. Pesach, your technical skills brought us the visual poems which enriched the programs. I know I'm not supposed to. His name isn't even on the program. How can I express our gratitude to Voices Israel President Julian Alper, who put this evening together? Perhaps I might say he brings light to everything he touches. Professor Mara Lee Grayson, Dr. Grayson, I'm not an academic. I can't run your work through the correct poetic framework or analyze its literary framework. Perhaps a quote from Elie Goldblatt, who wrote about anti-Semitism and the white supremacy issue. I'm sorry, I can't even read the title without stumbling. He wrote, Professor Grayson's words also charge me explicitly in my Jewishness. Maybe Vasily Grossman, who wrote in his novel Life and Fate, anti-Semitism is a mirror for the failings of individuals, social structures, and state systems. Tell me what you accuse the Jews of, and I'll tell you what you are guilty of. What can I tell you? I wish I could say anti-Semitic conspiracy theories are new. They have been following us doggedly for over 3,000 years. If I may quote Exodus 1:10, come let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply and it come to pass, when they fall upon us any war, they join also unto our enemies and fight against us. What can I tell you, Dr. Grayson? Your poems affect me. I listened to you present, call it coping, call it what you will, in Pedestal Magazine's 90th issues. Your last 5 lines. Our minds have tricked us into thinking language can put chaos into order, like a man awoken from a 3-month coma, like a bleeding woman walking down a mountain. Professor, you grabbed me by my shoulder, shook me. I nearly fell down. Then you held me up. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you, everybody. It was delightful to be here. And I so enjoyed talking to you about the poems. And I so enjoyed hearing your readings of the poems and hearing about your own work as well.